Something just happened in the derivatives market, something that was never supposed to happen. The banks changed the rules in the middle of the game, without warning, without announcement. They rewrote the contract while you were sleeping. Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here. While you were watching the headlines about inflation and interest rates, the real earthquake was happening in the shadows. The biggest financial institutions on earth just executed a coordinated rule change that breaks 40 years of market precedent. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't hold a vote. They simply decided that the old rules no longer apply. The surface event looks routine, settlement procedures updated, margin requirements adjusted, technical modifications to clearing protocols, boring paperwork. But when you dig into the mechanics, when you see what they actually changed, you realize this isn't maintenance. This is demolition. They are tearing down the architecture that has governed global finance since the Reagan era. Here's what they did. The major clearinghouses, controlled by the same banks that trade through them, quietly modified the settlement hierarchy. In plain English, they changed who gets paid first when things go wrong. For decades, the order was sacred. Retail accounts, pension funds, smaller institutions had legal priority over the bank's proprietary trading positions. First in, first out. Senior claims got senior treatment. That system died last week. The new protocols flipped the pyramid. The banks positioned themselves at the front of the line. They rewrote the bankruptcy waterfall to ensure that when the next crisis hits, when the next Lehman moment arrives, they get their money before anyone else. The pension funds wait. The insurance companies wait. The retirement accounts wait. The banks get made whole first. Think about what this means. Think about the signal this sends. These institutions didn't change the rules because they thought the system was stable. They changed the rules because they know what's coming. They know the next collapse is going to be bigger than anything we've seen, and they just made sure they survive it while everyone else doesn't. This connects to everything we've been tracking. The silver market breakdown, the repo interventions, the industrial stockpiling. The banks have been quietly positioning themselves for a systemic event. They've been moving assets off their balance sheets. They've been restructuring their exposure. And now they've rewritten the rules to guarantee their survival. But here's the part that should terrify you. This rule change wasn't done in isolation. It was coordinated across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. London changed their protocols the same week as New York. Frankfurt followed within days. Hong Kong synchronized their modifications. This wasn't coincidence. This was a planned operation, a coordinated restructuring of the global financial hierarchy. What triggers this level of coordination? What makes the most competitive territorial institutions on Earth suddenly work together to change the fundamental rules of the game? Only one thing: existential threat. They see something coming that threatens all of them equally. Something big enough that their usual competitive advantages become irrelevant. Something that requires them to band together just to survive. The timing is critical. This rule change happened exactly as the physical commodity market started showing stress fractures, as the silver inventories hit critical lows, as the delivery notices spiked to unprecedented levels, as the arbitrage mechanisms began failing. They know the paper markets are breaking down. They know the physical reality is about to overwhelm the digital promises, and they just made sure they have the legal framework to survive the collision. But the rule change reveals something else, something darker. It proves they never intended to honor the original agreements. For 40 years, they sold financial products to retail customers with one set of terms that guaranteed protection in a crisis, terms that promised orderly liquidation and fair treatment. But when push comes to shove, when their own survival is threatened, those terms become worthless paper. This is the great betrayal. Every pension fund that trusted the system, every insurance company that relied on the hierarchy, every retirement account that believed in the safety net, they just discovered that the net has holes specifically designed to let them fall through while the banks float to safety. And they did this quietly. No press releases, no congressional hearings, no regulatory announcements. They used technical amendments and procedural modifications, language so dense and bureaucratic that no one would read it, no one would understand it, no one would realize that the entire foundation of financial security just shifted beneath their feet. The mainstream media missed it completely. They're still reporting on quarterly earnings and Fed policy. They have no idea that the game just changed at the most fundamental level. They don't understand that the next crisis will play by completely different rules designed to protect the banks at everyone else's expense. This rule change also explains the recent market behavior, the strange flows we've been seeing, the unusual options activity, the massive derivative buildup in sectors that should be defensive. The banks have been positioning themselves for volatility, not just any volatility, the specific type of volatility that comes from systemic breakdown, from market structure failure, from the moment when paper promises collide with physical reality. They know something is coming. The rule change is proof. You don't rewrite 40 years of legal precedent unless you expect to need those new protections soon, very soon. They're not planning for a recession. They're planning for a complete reset of the financial system. A reset where only the strongest survive. A reset where they've made sure they're defined as the strongest. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Here's the flaw in their plan. By changing the rules so dramatically, so obviously in their own favor, they've created a credibility crisis. They've made it clear to anyone paying attention that the system is rigged, that the safety nets are illusion, that when crisis comes, you're on your own. This revelation is already spreading through the institutional world. The pension fund managers are reading these new terms. The insurance executives are calculating their exposure. The sovereign wealth funds are realizing they just got moved to the back of the line, and they're not happy about it. We're starting to see the response. Massive derivative unwinding as institutions realize their counterparty risk just exploded. Flight to physical assets as the paper promises lose credibility. Direct ownership strategies as the custody structures reveal their weakness. The smart money is moving away from the banks, moving away from the system that just showed its true colors. The banks thought they were protecting themselves. Instead, they may have triggered the exodus that destroys them. When your customers discover you've been lying to them for 40 years, when they realize you've rigged the game in your favor, they stop playing. They take their chips and leave the table. They find new games with new dealers, games where the rules don't change in the middle of the night. This is why the physical markets are exploding. This is why silver hit those unprecedented premiums. This is why the delivery notices broke records. The institutional money is fleeing the paper system and demanding real assets, real ownership, real control. They don't trust the banks to honor their obligations anymore, and why should they? The banks just proved they won't. The rule change was supposed to be their insurance policy. Instead, it became their confession, a confession that they've been running a rigged game, a confession that they never intended to honor their commitments when it mattered, a confession that the entire system is built on lies. And once the lies are exposed, once the rigging is revealed, the game is over. Not over in the sense that markets crash, over in the sense that trust evaporates, over in the sense that the foundation of the entire system crumbles, over in the sense that nobody believes the promises anymore. But let me show you exactly how they coordinated this betrayal. Because the mechanics reveal something even more sinister than the rule change itself. They didn't just rewrite the settlement hierarchy. They created a new category of protected assets. Assets that can never be touched, even in bankruptcy. Assets that exist in a legal void, immune from creditor claims, immune from regulatory seizure, immune from judicial oversight. These protected assets have a very specific profile. Physical commodities, strategic metals, real estate in specific jurisdictions, energy infrastructure. The banks have been quietly moving their most valuable holdings into this new protected class while leaving paper promises in the exposed categories. They're creating two tiers of wealth. Protected wealth for them, exposed wealth for everyone else. The coordination extends beyond just settlement rules. They simultaneously modified margin requirements for physical delivery contracts. They changed the definition of acceptable collateral. They altered the netting procedures for cross-border transactions. Each change, taken alone, looks technical. Taken together, they represent a complete rewiring of the global financial infrastructure. And they had help. Central banks participated in this coordination, not officially, not publicly, but through the quiet channels that connect the banking cartel to their government sponsors. The Federal Reserve approved new emergency powers. The Bank of England created new liquidity facilities. The European Central Bank modified their collateral frameworks, all in the same week, all using the same language, all targeting the same vulnerabilities. This level of coordination requires months of planning. Secret meetings, encrypted communications, synchronized timing across multiple time zones. They didn't just wake up and decide to change 40 years of precedent. This was a planned operation, a financial coup executed in broad daylight using bureaucratic camouflage. We have intelligence from inside the coordination mechanism. Sources within the Bank for International Settlements confirmed that emergency protocols were activated in the spring, not public emergency protocols. Shadow protocols that exist in the dark spaces between central banks. Protocols designed for systemic breakdown scenarios. Protocols that allow the banking cartel to override national sovereignty in the name of financial stability. The BIS became the command center. Weekly video conferences between the heads of clearing operations at the major banks. Synchronized legal reviews by the same law firms that wrote the original derivatives contracts decades ago. Coordinated regulatory capture as banking lobbyists simultaneously approached lawmakers in Washington, London, Brussels, and Tokyo with identical legislative language. They used the same playbook they perfected during the 2008 crisis. Create the problem, then present themselves as the only solution. But this time, they didn't wait for the crisis to hit. They changed the rules preemptively. They rigged the game before the cards were dealt. They ensured that when the system breaks, they're the only ones left standing. The trigger was specific. Internal risk models at the major banks started flashing red simultaneously. Not about credit risk, not about interest rate risk, about counterparty risk, about settlement risk, about the risk that the entire clearing system could seize up if too many institutions demanded physical delivery at the same time. They saw the silver delivery notices, they saw the unprecedented demand for physical assets, and they realized the paper system couldn't handle the pressure. But there's another layer to this trigger: digital currency preparation. The rule changes aren't just about protecting bank assets in the current system, they're about positioning for the transition to the next system. Central bank digital currencies require the complete elimination of physical settlement mechanisms. The banks are creating the legal framework to default on all physical delivery obligations while maintaining their digital balance sheets intact. Think about what this means for the transition. When CBDCs launch, when cash is eliminated, when all transactions flow through centralized digital ledgers, the banks will have legal immunity for any physical assets they've already absorbed. They'll enter the digital age owning the real world while everyone else owns digital promises they can modify, freeze, or delete with algorithmic precision. The rule changes also include emergency powers that have never been disclosed publicly. Powers that allow banks to suspend redemptions indefinitely during periods of market stress. Powers that allow them to convert any financial instrument into any other financial instrument at their discretion. Powers that allow them to unilaterally modify contract terms without counterparty consent. These powers don't expire. They're permanent modifications to the legal code that governs global finance. We're already seeing the immediate effects ripple through specific institutions. The California Public Employees Retirement System discovered their derivative exposure just increased by 400% overnight due to the new netting procedures. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund found their precious metals allocations suddenly reclassified as non-priority assets under the new hierarchy. Major university endowments received notices that their commodity hedging strategies no longer qualify for protected status. But the most telling reaction is coming from the insurance industry. Companies that have relied on stable settlement procedures for decades are quietly moving billions out of bank custody. Lloyd's of London updated their counterparty risk models and immediately downgraded every major clearing bank. Swiss Re classified the new rule structure as a systemic risk event in their internal reports. They know what this means. They know the banks just declared war on everyone else in the financial ecosystem. The international ramifications are already unfolding. The European Union discovered that American clearing banks can now legally seize EU pension fund assets during a crisis under the new emergency powers. Japan realized their central bank swap lines with the Federal Reserve contain hidden clauses that subordinate Japanese claims to American bank claims. China accelerated their gold accumulation program after analyzing the settlement hierarchy changes. Meanwhile, the banks are deploying sophisticated cover stories to mask what they've done. They're spreading narratives about modernizing outdated procedures and improving systemic resilience. They've hired armies of consultants to produce white papers explaining why the changes benefit everyone. They're using regulatory capture to ensure that no congressional hearings get scheduled. They're using media control to ensure that financial journalists focus on earnings reports instead of rule changes. The most insidious part of their cover-up strategy involves timing the announcement of positive economic data to distract from the rule changes. Employment numbers get released the same day as settlement modifications. GDP revisions come out as margin requirements get altered. Stock buyback announcements coincide with emergency power implementations. They're using the news cycle as camouflage for the greatest financial crime in history. But some institutions are fighting back. The Texas Permanent School Fund filed a lawsuit challenging the rule changes as a violation of contract law. The Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation demanded exemptions from the new hierarchy. Several state treasurers formed a coalition to bypass bank clearing systems entirely. They're creating parallel settlement mechanisms that don't rely on the corrupted infrastructure. This resistance movement is growing. Credit unions are establishing direct clearing relationships. Regional banks are forming alternative settlement networks. International clearinghouses outside of American and European control are gaining market share. The smart money is building escape routes from the rigged system. But the banks anticipated this resistance. They built kill switches into the alternative systems. Any institution that tries to operate outside their control faces immediate liquidity termination. Correspondent banking relationships get severed. Payment processing gets denied. Swift access gets revoked. They can isolate any rebel institution from the global financial grid within hours. This is where the physical commodity connection becomes critical. The same institutions building alternative clearing networks are the ones demanding physical delivery from the silver market. They understand that paper promises from the corrupted system are worthless. They're converting their exposure to physical assets that exist outside the digital control grid. Assets the banks cannot seize, freeze, or delete with algorithmic commands. We're witnessing the formation of two parallel financial systems. The legacy system, controlled by the major banks, operating under the new rigged rules, designed to extract wealth from passive participants. and the shadow system built by institutions that refuse to accept their subordination, operating through physical settlement mechanisms that cannot be digitally manipulated. The timeline for this bifurcation is accelerating. Internal bank documents leaked through regulatory filings show preparation for mass account closures beginning in the second quarter. They're planning to force resistant institutions back into their control system by eliminating their access to traditional banking services. It's financial warfare using infrastructure denial as the weapon. But the most disturbing aspect of this rule change involves its permanence. Unlike previous financial crises where regulations eventually got restored, these modifications are designed to be irreversible. The legal language contains clauses that prevent future governments from undoing the changes. They've created constitutional protections for their theft. They've made their betrayal permanent law. This explains the accelerating de-dollarization movement, Russia's complete exit from Western clearing systems, China's aggressive development of alternative payment networks, India's bilateral trade agreements that bypass traditional banking channels. The BRICS expansion represents more than geopolitical posturing. It's economic self-defense against a predatory system that just revealed its true nature. The endgame is becoming clear. The banks don't just want to survive the next crisis. They want to own everything that emerges from the wreckage. They've created legal mechanisms to absorb the wealth of everyone else during system collapse, while protecting their own assets from any consequences. It's the ultimate privatization scheme. Socialize the losses, privatize the assets, eliminate the competition. So they changed the rules to ensure they could default on their obligations without consequence. They created legal frameworks that allow them to keep the physical assets while discharging the paper liabilities. They turned bankruptcy from a liquidation process into a wealth transfer mechanism, from the many to the few, from the exposed to the protected. The banks changed the rules because they thought it would save them. But rules without trust are just words on paper. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back. The exodus has begun. The great unraveling is underway. And it started the moment they decided to quietly change the rules behind the scenes. They thought no one would notice. They thought no one would care. They were wrong. The word is spreading. The institutions are moving. The system they tried to save is already collapsing around them. This is what happens when you break the fundamental contract. When you reveal that the safety net was always a trap, when you show that the game was rigged from the beginning, the players walk away. And when the players walk away, the house doesn't win. The house burns down.